The mansion had never been so silent. Only hours earlier, doctors had told the billionaire's family to prepare for the worst. Their only son, the heir to everything they had built, was fading fast, and no one seemed able to save him. Then the maid did something nobody expected. She ignored the family's orders, rushed into the chaos, and made a desperate decision that changed everything. Somehow, against all odds, the young man survived. But instead of gratitude, she received humiliation. The billionaire's family accused her of crossing a line. They called her reckless, disrespectful, and unworthy of remaining under their roof. And when they discovered she was pregnant, their judgment became even colder. Before nightfall, she was standing outside the towering iron gates with one small suitcase, nowhere to go, and tears she refused to let them see. The family believed they had erased an embarrassing chapter from their lives. They were wrong. Months passed. The billionaire's son recovered, but strange questions began haunting him. Why had the maid risked everything to save him? Why had his family refused to speak about her afterward? And why did his father become visibly uncomfortable whenever her name was mentioned? Then, one rainy afternoon, a black car stopped outside the mansion. The gates opened, and the maid stepped out. She was no longer alone. In her arms was something that made the billionaire's wife drop the glass she was holding. Behind her stood two people carrying a sealed folder, an old photograph, and evidence connected to a secret the family had buried for years. The billionaire went pale. His son stared at her in disbelief. What had she discovered after being thrown out? Who was the baby really connected to? What was hidden inside that folder? And why did one old photograph suddenly threaten to destroy everything the billionaire's family thought they knew? If you believe kindness should never be repaid with cruelty, and that people should never be judged by their job, their clothes, or the amount of money in their bank account, kindly subscribe and turn on the notification bell now. Stories like this remind us that the person society overlooks today may be the very person holding the truth tomorrow. Stay with us until the end, because what Emily Carter discovered after walking away from those gates did not only change her life, it forced one powerful family to face a secret they had spent more than 20 years trying to bury. Emily Carter arrived at the Whitmore estate 18 months before the night that changed everything. She had not arrived in a limousine. She had not arrived carrying designer luggage. She came on a city bus with one brown suitcase, a pair of worn black shoes, and a folded photograph hidden inside the smallest pocket of her purse. The Whitmore estate stood on more than 40 acres outside Connecticut, surrounded by stone walls, trimmed hedges, fountains, and iron gates tall enough to make an ordinary visitor feel as though the people living beyond them belonged to another world. Richard Whitmore certainly did. His technology and investment empire had made him one of the wealthiest businessmen on the East Coast. Newspapers described him as disciplined, brilliant, and impossible to intimidate. Business magazines photographed him in tailored suits beside glass towers carrying his family name. At home, however, Richard was quieter. Sometimes too quiet. Emily noticed that during her first week. He would return late from Manhattan, hand his coat to the staff, nod politely, and disappear into his study. His wife, Victoria Whitmore, was elegant and socially powerful, the kind of woman whose charity dinners appeared in magazines. Their 24-year-old son, Ethan, had recently returned from graduate school and was expected to take a larger role in the family business. And then there was Elena Whitmore, Richard's 78-year-old mother. Everyone in the house called her Mrs. Whitmore, even though there were technically two Mrs. Whitmores living under the same roof. Nobody seemed confused about which one mattered more. Elena had a way of entering a room and making conversations die without raising her voice. She noticed fingerprints on polished tables, flowers that had begun to wilt, shoes placed half an inch out of line, and employees who spoke when she believed silence would have been more appropriate. On Emily's first morning, Elena studied her from across the breakfast room. "You are younger than the last one." Emily lowered her eyes respectfully. "Yes, ma'am." "How old?" 26. "Family?" "My mother passed away." "Father?" Emily hesitated. "I never knew him." Something changed in Elena's face. Only for a second. So quickly Emily wondered if she had imagined it. Then Elena lifted her coffee cup. People without family often become unreliable because they have nothing tying them to responsibility. Emily felt the insult, but she swallowed it. "I take my responsibilities seriously, ma'am." Elena looked at her for another long moment. "I'm sure you believe that." Emily left the room wondering why the old woman's hand had trembled when she mentioned not knowing her father. Months later, she would remember that tremble. She would remember many things. The way Elena once froze after finding Emily humming an old song while dusting the upstairs hallway. The way Richard stared at Emily during a Christmas dinner and then apologized, saying she reminded him of someone. The way an old photograph disappeared from the library 2 hours after Emily noticed it. At the time, none of it meant anything. Emily had more immediate problems. She had taken the job because medical bills and funeral expenses had consumed nearly everything she had saved. Her husband, Noah Bennett, had died 7 months before she joined the Whitmore staff. Noah had been the opposite of everyone living inside that mansion. He had never cared about expensive things. He worked long hours as an emergency medical technician and still came home with enough energy to make Emily laugh when she believed the world had used up every reason she had for smiling. They had met in a grocery store after Emily accidentally knocked a tower of canned tomatoes into an aisle. Noah helped her pick them up. Then he announced with ridiculous seriousness, "I've seen disasters before, but this may require federal assistance." She laughed. He asked for coffee. 4 years later, they were married in a small ceremony attended by fewer than 30 people. Their apartment had leaking pipes. Their couch came from a second-hand store. Their kitchen table had one leg slightly shorter than the others. Emily had thought she was rich. Then, on a cold October evening, a driver lost control on a rain-covered highway. Noah never came home. For months afterward, Emily could not hear an ambulance without remembering the knock on the door. She kept his wedding ring in a small wooden box beside her bed. She kept his jacket because it still smelled faintly like him. And she kept one promise he had made her repeat whenever life became frightening. "Don't become hard just because the world is." That sentence followed her into the Whitmore mansion. It followed her through Elena's insults. It followed her when guests sometimes handed her empty glasses without looking at her face. It followed her when Victoria criticized employees for tiny mistakes. And it followed her into Ethan Whitmore's life. Unlike his grandmother, Ethan spoke to the household staff as though they were human beings. He knew the gardener's daughter's name. He thanked the cooks. When Emily broke a crystal vase during her 3rd month, he found her staring at the pieces with horror. "My grandmother is going to bury me beneath the rose garden," Emily whispered. Ethan looked at the shattered vase. "Probably." She stared at him. He smiled. Fortunately, that vase was ugly. Emily laughed before she could stop herself. Ethan helped her gather the pieces. Nothing romantic ever existed between them, though Elena eventually suggested otherwise. What developed instead was something simpler. Friendship. Ethan sometimes found Emily reading in the library during her break. She learned that he disliked the way Everyone assumed his father's company automatically belonged in his future. He learned that Emily had once hoped to finish a nursing program, but had dropped out when her mother became sick. "You should go back," Ethan told her one afternoon. "Maybe someday." Someday is usually where people store things they're afraid to try. Was that in one of your expensive business school textbooks? No fortune cookie. She laughed. From the hallway, Elena watched them. Neither noticed. 3 weeks later, Elena summoned Emily into the sunroom. "My grandson is kind." Emily waited. He has always had difficulty understanding when people mistake kindness for opportunity. Emily immediately understood. "Mrs. Watmer, Ethan and I are only friends." "I didn't ask." "No, but you're implying." "I don't imply." Elena's voice remained calm. "Women have been trying to attach themselves to wealthy families since wealth was invented." Emily felt heat rise into her face. "I was married." "So I was told." "My husband died." A tragedy does not make someone immune to ambition. Emily stared at her. For one reckless moment, she wanted to place her apron on the table and walk out. Then she remembered rent. Debt. The nursing course brochure hidden in her suitcase. And the strange exhaustion she had been feeling every morning. So she said only, "Is there anything else?" Eleanor's eyes dropped briefly toward Emily's stomach. "No." 2 days later, Emily bought a pregnancy test. She took it inside the employee bathroom before dawn. Then she sat on the closed toilet lid for almost 20 minutes staring at the result. Positive. Her hand covered her mouth. She cried silently. Not because she did not want the baby. Because for the first time since Noah's death, grief and joy entered the same room. She remembered the last breakfast they had shared. Noah had burned the toast. Emily had complained that the smell would stay in the apartment all day. He kissed her forehead and told her he would cook dinner to make up for it. He never did. Now sitting alone beneath the fluorescent light of a mansion that did not belong to her, Emily pressed a hand against her stomach. "Your daddy would have loved you," she whispered. She told no one. Not yet. She needed time. But the mansion seemed to sense secrets. And the Watmer family had lived among secrets for far longer than Emily understood. Richard began noticing her more often. Once he walked into the kitchen and found Emily peeling apples for a pie. He stopped. "What?" Emily looked behind herself. Richard blinked. "Nothing, sorry. You looked like you seen a ghost." A strange sadness crossed his face. "My father used to say ghosts are simply memories that refuse to stay buried." He left without explaining. Another time, Emily found him standing before a locked cabinet in his study. He was holding an old silver pendant. When Emily entered to collect an empty cup, Richard quickly closed his fist around it. But not before she saw the engraved initials. S.Lee. Her mother's name had been Sarah Carter. Emily told herself it was coincidence. There were millions of people with those initials. Still, something uneasy settled in her chest. Weeks later, while cleaning the library, she found an old college yearbook tucked behind several leather-bound books. A younger Richard smiled from one page. Beside him stood a young woman with long brown hair and unmistakable eyes. Emily's eyes. Below the photograph were 2 handwritten names. Richard Watmer. Sarah Collins. Emily stopped breathing. Her mother's maiden name had been Collins. She heard footsteps. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. For perhaps the first time since Emily had met her, the older woman looked frightened. "Where did you find that?" It was behind the books. Alana crossed the room and took it. Her fingers tightened around the cover. Old photographs invite old misunderstandings. My mother's maiden name was Collins. I don't care what your mother's name was. But Alana cared. Amelie could see it. That evening, the yearbook disappeared. When Amelie asked Richard about Sarah Collins several days later, his face lost color. Where did you hear that name? I saw it in an old yearbook. Richard lowered himself slowly into his chair. We were friends. Just friends. His eyes lifted toward hers. Before he could answer, Alana entered the room. Richard, Victoria is waiting. Richard looked at his mother. Something unspoken passed between them. Then he stood. We can discuss this another time. They never did. Because 3 nights later, Uthan collapsed. The Watmaras were hosting a formal dinner for investors. Crystal glasses gleamed beneath chandeliers. A string quartet played near the terrace. Nearly 80 guests filled the ballroom. Amelie had been helping in the kitchen when she heard something crash. Then someone screamed Uthan's name. She ran. Uthan was on the floor. Richard knelt beside him. Victoria was crying. Several guests stood frozen. Someone had already called emergency services, but the estate was far enough from town that every minute felt enormous. Uthan had struggled with a serious medical condition since childhood, one the family carefully kept away from newspapers. Earlier that week, he had complained about unusual symptoms, but Alana dismissed them as stress. Now his condition was rapidly worsening. Amelie saw panic. Then she remembered Noah. Not instructions. Not procedures. His voice. In emergencies, he used to tell her, fear makes people wait for somebody else to become brave. Amelie moved forward. Uthan. Alana grabbed her arm. Stay back. He needs help. The ambulance is coming. Amelie looked at Uthan. Something about what she was seeing reminded her of an emergency awareness course she had taken years earlier, and of conversations with Noah about recognizing when someone was in immediate danger. I can help. You are household staff, Alana snapped. Amelie pulled her arm free. And he's dying. The room went silent. Amelie acted. She did only what she knew was appropriate from her prior training and followed directions being relayed by emergency dispatch until professionals arrived. Those minutes seemed endless. Richard held his son's hand. Victoria sobbed. Alana stood motionless, and Amelie refused to move away. When the paramedics finally arrived, they took over. One of them looked at Amelie after Uthan had been stabilized enough for transport. You bought him time. Richard heard it. So did Alana. Hours later, the hospital confirmed Uthan had survived the immediate crisis. Richard sat with his face buried in his hands. Victoria cried with relief. Amelie stood quietly near the wall. She expected nothing. Maybe a thank you. Maybe permission to return to the mansion and sleep. Instead, Alana turned toward her. You disobeyed me. Amelie stared. Excuse me. I told you to stay back. Uthan was dying. You interfered in a private family emergency. Richard looked up. Mother. No, this must be dealt with. Victoria was exhausted, frightened, and still shaking. Perhaps that was why she joined Alana instead of stopping her. You could have made things worse. But I didn't. You didn't know that when you interfered, Victoria said. Amelie's voice trembled. I was trying to save your son. Alana's expression hardened. And now you expect what? Amalie's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? Money, security, perhaps a permanent connection to this family. Richard stood. That's enough. But Alana's attention had shifted downward. Amalie had opened her coat, and the slight curve she had been hiding beneath loose uniforms was visible. Alana stared. Then Victoria noticed. You are pregnant. Amalie instinctively placed a hand over her stomach. Yes. Alana's eyes became cold. How convenient. Amalie understood immediately. No. Mother, Richard warned again. Alana ignored him. How far along? That is none of your business. Is Uthan the father? The question struck like a slap. Richard shouted, Mother. Amalie's face drained of culpa. My husband is the father. I was told your husband died before you came here. He did. Alana looked unconvinced. Amalie's grief turned into fury. You don't get to speak about him. Victoria whispered, Alana, maybe we should. No, we have seen this before. Alana stopped suddenly. Richard stared at her. Seen what before? Amalie heard the words too. Alana recovered quickly. People entering this family through manipulation. Amalie removed the employee identification card from her pocket. She placed it on the hospital table. You think I saved Uthan because I wanted something? Nobody answered. I saved him because he was my friend. Her voice cracked. And because my husband spent his life helping strangers without asking whether they were rich enough to deserve it. Richard stepped toward her. Amalie, don't leave tonight. Everyone's upset. We'll talk tomorrow. But Alana spoke first. Her employment is terminated. Richard turned. You cannot fire my employee. The household trust employs her, and I still control it. Amalie looked at Richard. The billionaire, who commanded rooms full of executives, suddenly appeared powerless before his mother. That hurt almost as much as Alana's cruelty. Richard could have stopped it. He did not. Emily left the hospital. When she returned to the mansion, her belongings had already been packed. One suitcase. 18 months of her life reduced to one suitcase. Rain had begun falling. The security guard avoided her eyes as the gate opened. Before stepping outside, Emily turned toward the mansion. In an upstairs window, Elena stood watching. Emily remembered the yearbook. Sarah Collins. Richard Whitmore. She remembered the silver pendant. S.Lee. And Elena's words. We have seen this before. A cold realization moved through her. There was something in that house more dangerous than arrogance. There was fear. Emily walked away. For 6 weeks, she rented a room above a bakery owned by an older woman named Martha Reynolds. Martha asked few questions. She simply saw a pregnant widow needing work and offered Emily part-time bookkeeping. At night, Emily searched through boxes that had belonged to her mother. Sarah Carter had died after a long illness 3 years earlier. She had rarely spoken about Emily's father. Whenever Emily asked, Sarah gave almost the same answer. He wasn't there because life became complicated. As a teenager, Emily had assumed that meant abandonment. Now she wondered. One Saturday afternoon, she opened a box she had not touched since the funeral. Inside were tax papers, recipes, birthday cards, and old photographs. At the bottom lay an envelope. On the front, in Sarah's handwriting, were the words, "For Emily, when the past finds her." Emily sat completely still. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a key. A bank deposit receipt dated 27 years earlier. And a short note. Emily, if you are reading this, then something I hoped would remain behind us has found its way into your life. Go to First National Trust in Hartford. Ask for box 417. The key will explain what I never had the courage to tell you. Forgive me, Mom. Emily read it 3 times. 2 days later, she entered the bank. The security box contained a photograph. The same photograph she had seen in the Whitmore library. Only this copy was clearer. Richard Whitmore stood beside Sarah Collins. They were not simply college friends. Sarah wore a white dress. Richard wore a dark suit. They were holding hands outside a courthouse. Behind the photograph were words written by Sarah. The day we promised forever. June 14, 1998. Emily felt dizzy. Beneath it was a marriage certificate. Richard Allen Whitmore. Sarah Marie Collins. Legally married. Emily stared at the date. 10 months before her birth. There were letters too. Dozens. Most were written by Richard. Sarah. Mother still refuses to accept us, but I don't care. Give me time. I will tell my father, and then no one will be able to push you out of my life. Another. I went to your apartment. You were gone. Mother says you decided this family wasn't worth the trouble. I don't believe her. Please call me. Then another. This one had never been opened. Because it had never been delivered. Across the envelope, someone had written "Return to sender." Emily's heart pounded. At the bottom of the box was a letter from Sarah. Richard never knew about you. His mother made sure of that. Emily covered her mouth. The room blurred through tears. Sarah explained everything. Elena Whitmore had discovered the marriage shortly after Richard and Sarah married in secret. At the time, the Whitmore company was struggling through a major acquisition. Richard's father believed a scandal involving his son's secret marriage to a woman from an ordinary family could harm negotiations with wealthy investors. Elena offered Sarah money to disappear. Sarah refused. Then Elena threatened something worse. She told Sarah that Richard had agreed the marriage was a mistake. She produced papers appearing to show that he wanted an annulment. Pregnant, frightened, and humiliated, Sarah left. Months later, she tried contacting Richard. Her letters returned. Calls never reached him. Someone had blocked every path. Eventually, Sarah concluded Richard truly wanted nothing to do with them. She changed her surname to Carter, using her grandmother's family name, and raised Emily alone. But years later, Sarah discovered the truth. The annulment documents had been fraudulent. Richard had searched for her. By then, he was married to Victoria. Their son, Ethan, had been born. Sarah decided revealing everything would destroy 2 families. So she stayed silent. Emily sat in that bank room until an employee gently asked whether she needed water. She could barely speak. The billionaire whose floors she had scrubbed was her father. The young man she had saved was her half-brother. And the woman who had thrown her into the rain had done nearly the same thing to her mother 27 years earlier. That night, Emily called the name listed on another document in the box. Henry Dawson, attorney. He was 72 now and had retired years earlier. But when Emily said Sarah Collins, the silence on the other end lasted almost 15 seconds. Where are you? He asked. They met the next morning. Henry arrived carrying guilt that seemed older than Emily. I worked for Richard's father, he explained. I knew what Elena had done. Emily's voice was quiet. And you said nothing. I was young, ambitious, cowardly. He did not defend himself. That made Emily angrier somehow. My mother raised me alone. I know. My father thought she abandoned him. I know. And you let that happen. Henry lowered his head. Yes. Emily stood to leave. Then Henry said, "There is more." She stopped. Elena's actions had not ended with separating Richard and Sarah. When Richard's father died, a private trust had been created for any legally recognized descendants of Richard Whitmore. Elena had concealed the existence of Richard's first marriage from the estate attorneys. If Emily could establish paternity, she would not merely be Richard's daughter. She would have legal rights Elena had spent decades ensuring she never discovered. Emily shook her head. I don't want their money. This isn't only about money. Henry opened a folder. There are records showing Elena repeatedly intercepted correspondence. There is also a sworn statement from the former household secretary. She's alive. Yes. Her name was Linda Parker. She had worked for the Whitmores for 32 years. Linda had resigned after Elena ordered her to destroy one final letter from Sarah. Instead, Linda kept it. She had been waiting for years for someone to ask. The following weeks changed Emily. Not in the way Elena might have expected. She did not become obsessed with revenge. She became determined to know the truth. Richard agreed to a private DNA test only after Ethan contacted Emily first. Ethan had found her number through a former employee. His voice was quiet when she answered. Emily. She nearly hung up. I'm sorry. She said nothing. My grandmother was wrong. Still nothing. And I was a coward. That surprised her. You were unconscious for most of it. I'm talking about afterward. He had awakened in the hospital asking for her. Elena told him Emily had resigned. Victoria repeated the story. Richard said little. Only later did Ethan learn she had been dismissed. I should have found you sooner. Why are you calling now? Because my father hasn't been himself since you left. Emily's grip tightened around the phone. What does that have to do with me? He keeps looking through old boxes. He asked my grandmother about a woman named Sarah. Emily closed her eyes. Ethan continued. And yesterday I heard them arguing. What did they say? My father asked her whether she knew who you were before she fired you. Emily's heart stopped. What did Elena say? She didn't answer. That was answer enough. Richard contacted Emily the next day. They met in Henry Dawson's office. When Richard saw the courthouse photograph on the desk, he sat down slowly. For several seconds, he looked as though someone had removed 27 years from his life. Zero. Emily watched him touch the edge of the photograph. You were married to her. His eyes filled. I loved her. Emily's voice became sharp. Then why didn't you find her? I tried. Not hard enough. Richard accepted the blow. Maybe not. He explained his side. After Sarah vanished, Elena told him she had accepted money and left. Richard refused to believe it. For almost 2 years, he searched. Investigators found nothing because Elena secretly paid one of them to misdirect the search. Eventually, Richard believed Sarah had chosen another life. He met Victoria years later. He never told her he had actually been married before. Because his mother insisted the courthouse marriage had been legally erased. It had not. Did you know about me? Emily asked. Richard shook his head. No. I was in your house for 18 months. His face crumpled. I know. You walked past me. I know. You let your mother throw me out. Richard looked down. I know. Emily hated that answer. Because there was no excuse inside it. Only regret. The DNA results arrived 5 days later. Probability of biological relationship, greater than 99.9%. Emily Carter was Richard Whitmore's daughter. Ethan was her half-brother. When Ethan read the results, he laughed once in disbelief. Then tears filled his eyes. You saved your brother. Emily looked at him. I saved my friend. He nodded. That too. For the first time, she smiled. The baby was born 2 months later. A girl. Emily named her Nora Sarah Bennett. Nora for Noah. Sarah for her mother. Richard sent flowers to the hospital. Emily almost returned them. Then she found a handwritten card. I missed your first day in this world. I will understand if you never allow me to witness another. But if you do, I will spend whatever years I have left proving that I know the difference between being your father and deserving to be one. Emily kept the card. She still did not call him. Not yet. Meanwhile, inside the Whitmore mansion, Elena's control began collapsing. Victoria learned everything. The secret marriage. The intercepted letters. Emily. The DNA test. For the first time in 40 years, Victoria confronted her mother-in-law without fear. You knew. Elena sat beside the fireplace. I suspected. You knew enough. I protected this family. Victoria laughed bitterly. From what, a daughter? From scandal. Emily wasn't a scandal. Her mother was Richard's wife. Elena's face hardened. That girl had no understanding of the world Richard belonged to. Victoria stared at her. And you thought I did. Silence. That was when Victoria finally understood something painful. Elena had not chosen her because she loved her. She had approved her. There was a difference. Victoria had spent decades believing acceptance into the Whitmore family was a prize. Now she realized it had been a cage decorated to resemble one. Ethan became colder toward his grandmother. Richard stopped speaking to her except when necessary. And Elena, who had spent her whole life protecting the family name, discovered that the name meant very little when everyone carrying it stopped trusting her. Then came the rainy afternoon. A black car moved slowly along the driveway. Richard saw it from the study. His heart began pounding before it even stopped. Victoria entered the foyer. Ethan came down the stairs. Elena remained seated in the drawing room, pretending not to care. The front doors opened. Emily stepped inside. She wore a simple navy dress. In her arms slept 3-month-old Nora. Behind her stood Henry Dawson and Linda Parker. Henry carried a sealed legal folder. Linda carried the old photograph. Victoria's glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the marble floor. Nobody moved. Richard stared at the baby. Emily looked at him. This is Nora. His lips parted. My granddaughter. Emily nodded. Richard covered his mouth. Ethan descended the final steps. Can I see her? Emily smiled faintly. You can meet your niece. Ethan approached carefully. The billionaire's son, who had once been carried out of this mansion fighting for his life, looked down at the tiny child in Emily's arms. Hey, Nora. The baby opened her eyes. Ethan laughed softly. Then Elena appeared. Her face changed when she saw the photograph. You. Linda Parker looked directly at her. Yes, Elena, me. Henry placed the sealed folder on the table. Richard turned toward his mother. What is this? Henry answered. The truth you should have received 27 years ago. Inside were Sarah's letters. Copies of bank transactions Elena had authorized. Statements from former employees. Records showing that Richard's search for Sarah had been deliberately obstructed. And documents proving Elena knew Sarah had been pregnant before Emily's birth. Richard stared at the final page. His hands began shaking. You knew about my daughter. Elena's voice was almost a whisper. I knew there might be a child. You knew. I was protecting you. From my own child. From destroying your future. Richard looked around the mansion. The paintings. The marble. The staircase. The enormous chandelier. Then at Emily. You call this my future? Elena straightened. Everything you have exists because difficult choices were made. Emily finally spoke. No. Everyone turned. Everything he has exists because people worked for it. You didn't protect the family, you controlled it. Elena stared at her. You know nothing about sacrifice. Emily's expression changed. My mother knew sacrifice. Elena flinched. She raised a daughter alone because you convinced her she wasn't good enough to stand beside the man who loved her. Emily stepped closer. My husband knew sacrifice. He spent his life helping people he didn't know. Another step. And I know enough about sacrifice to understand that real sacrifice is what you give up yourself. It is not something you force someone else to lose. Nobody spoke. Emily placed the courthouse photograph on the table. She kept this until she died. Richard could no longer hide his tears. Elena looked at the photograph. For the first time, her certainty cracked. I thought she would ruin him. Emily's voice softened. No, you ruined 27 years he could have had with his daughter. Elena sat down. The words seemed heavier than anger. Because they could not be argued away. Richard approached Emily slowly. I don't expect forgiveness. Good. He nodded. But I want you to know something. Emily waited. When you worked here, I sometimes looked at you and felt as though I knew you. Her eyes filled. You knew my face. Richard looked at the photograph. I knew your mother. The room blurred for Emily. For years, she had imagined her father as a man who had simply walked away. Now she knew the truth was more complicated. Richard had failed her without knowing she existed. Then he failed her again when she stood directly in front of him. That second failure belonged entirely to him. Forgiveness, Emily realized, did not require pretending neither failure had happened. It required deciding whether the future deserved a chance the past never received. She looked down at Nora. Noah's daughter. Sarah's granddaughter. Richard's granddaughter. Ethan's niece. One tiny child connecting people divided by years of pride and silence. Nora deserves a family that tells the truth, Emily said. Richard nodded. She does. If you're part of her life, there are no hidden boxes, no lies told because they're convenient, no deciding someone isn't good enough because they don't have money. Agreed. And I don't want your fortune. Richard swallowed. You're entitled to. I didn't say I wouldn't claim what legally belongs to me. For the first time, Ethan smiled. Emily continued. But I won't let money become the reason we pretend everything is repaired. Richard nodded again. I understand. Elena slowly stood. What happens to me? Everyone looked toward her. It was perhaps the first question she had asked in years, for which she had no power to control the answer. Emily studied the woman who had separated her parents. The woman who had insulted her husband after his death. The woman who had thrown her out while she carried Nora. Anger remained. Maybe it always would. But Emily remembered Noah's voice. Don't become hard just because the world is. What happens to you isn't mine to decide, Emily said. You'll have to live with what you did. For Elena, that answer was worse than punishment. Because money could pay fines. Lawyers could fight lawsuits. Influence could repair reputations. But no amount of money could buy back 27 lost birthdays. Richard's first chance to hold his daughter as a newborn was gone. Sarah's chance to hear him say he never abandoned her was gone. Emily's childhood questions could never be answered by the mother who had died believing silence was the least destructive option. Those losses were permanent. Over the following year, the Whitmore family changed in ways the newspapers never fully understood. Richard transferred control of the household trust away from Elena. He established an independent scholarship in Sarah Collins's name for single parents returning to school. Emily initially objected. I don't want charity disguised as guilt. It isn't for you, Richard told her. It's because of her. That distinction mattered. Emily returned to nursing school. Not because Uthan told her she should. Not because Richard could afford it. Because Noah had once believed she would. She moved into her own apartment rather than the Whitmore mansion. Richard offered a house. She refused. He offered a trust. She told Henry to handle it. What Emily accepted instead were smaller things. Coffee with Richard on Sunday mornings. Uthan babysitting Nora while Emily studied. Victoria showing up with far too many baby clothes and eventually learning to ask before buying more. Richard telling Emily stories about Sarah. Some made Emily laugh. Some made her cry. Apparently Sarah hated strawberries. Emily hated strawberries too. Sarah once threatened to throw Richard's expensive shoes into a lake after he mocked her driving. Emily laughed for 5 straight minutes. You really loved her, she said. Richard's smile faded. I never stopped. Emily looked at him. Mom thought you did. I know. It was the wound between them that would never fully close. But some wounds did not need to disappear in order for a life to continue around them. Uthan recovered steadily. His health crisis changed him too. He decided not to take over the company simply because generations expected him to. Instead, he created a foundation within Whitmore Holdings focused on expanding emergency health education and access in underserved communities. At the launch, reporters asked why. Uthan looked toward Emily, standing near the back with Nora. Because once, someone everybody underestimated refused to stand back when my life depended on it. He never identified her publicly without permission. That mattered to Emily. Eleanor moved out of the mansion 6 months later. She relocated to a smaller Whitmore property in Rudder Island. For a long time, Emily did not see her. Then, shortly before Nora's first birthday, a handwritten letter arrived. Emily recognized Eleanor's precise handwriting. She almost threw it away. Instead, she opened it. There were no excuses. No speeches about family honor. Only an admission. I spent my life believing love made people weak because love makes us vulnerable to loss. So I controlled everything I feared losing. In doing so, I created the very losses I feared. Emily read the sentence twice. Alana wrote that Sarah had once come to the mansion after Amelie was born. Amelie had never known. Sarah stood outside the same iron gates where Amelie would stand 27 years later. She carried baby Amelie in her arms. She asked Alana to tell Richard only one thing: that he had a daughter. Alana refused. The revelation made Amelie physically sit down. Her mother had stood there, at those gates, holding her. History had repeated itself so perfectly it felt almost impossible. Pregnant Amelie had been expelled through the same gates where Sarah had once buggered for acknowledgement of her child. The realization made the foreshadowing of everything Amelie had experienced inside that house suddenly clear. Alana's reaction when Amelie said she never knew her father. The old song, the yearbook, the silver pendant, the way Richard stared at her. Alana had recognized Sarah in Amelie long before she admitted it to herself. Perhaps that was why she had watched Amelie so closely. Perhaps suspicion slowly became certainty. And perhaps when she discovered Amelie's pregnancy, Alana had seen history returning in a form she could not control. So she repeated the only response she knew. She pushed it outside the gates. Amelie folded the letter. She did not forgive Alana that day. Forgiveness was not a switch. But she placed the letter inside the same wooden box where she kept Noah's wedding ring. Years later, when Nora was old enough to ask about the photograph of the young woman standing beside Richard outside a courthouse, Amelie told her the truth. Not the polished version. Not the wealthy family version. The truth. This was your grandmother Sarah. Was she rich? Nora asked. Amelie smiled. No. Was she important? Amelie's smile slowly disappeared. Very. Wide. Amelie looked across the room. Richard was helping Ethan assemble a toy shelf, despite both men refusing to read the instructions. Victoria was laughing at them. On the piano sat a framed photograph of Noah. Beside it was Sarah's courthouse photograph. Amelie looked back at her daughter. Because someone's value isn't decided by how much money they have. Nora considered this seriously. Grandpa has a lot of money. Way too much. Richard called from across the room. I heard that. Nora giggled. Amelie continued. Money can build a big house, it can buy beautiful things, it can solve some problems, but it can't make someone kind, it can't make someone brave, and it can't make someone better than another person. Nora pointed toward Amelie. Were you a maid? I was. In Grandpa's house. Yes. Did he know you were his daughter? No. Nora's eyes widened. That's crazy. Ethan burst out laughing. Richard covered his face. Amelie smiled. That's one way to describe it. Nora thought for another moment. Did you save Uncle Ethan? Amelie glanced toward Ethan. He placed a dramatic hand over his heart. She did, and I've been annoying her ever since. Nora laughed again. Then she climbed into Amelie's lap. Mom. Yes. Are you glad you went to that house? Amelie looked around. That question was harder than Nora understood. If Amelie had never entered the Watma mansion, she might never have discovered her father. She would not have known Ethan. She would not have learned what Alana had done. She would have been spared humiliation. But she would also have remained trapped inside a lie. Amelie remembered herself standing in the rain with one suitcase. At that moment, she had believed she was leaving with nothing. She had been wrong. She carried Noah's child, her mother's courage, her own dignity. and a truth powerful enough to reopen gates that wealth had once slammed shut. "Yes," she told Nora. "I'm glad." Richard looked at her from across the room. Their eyes met. No words were needed. The Watmer mansion still stood behind iron gates. Its marble remained polished. Its chandeliers still glittered. But something fundamental had changed. People who entered through the servants' entrance were addressed by name. Employees could raise concerns without fear. Uthan had insisted on it. Richard supported him. Victoria enforced it. There was no longer a portrait of Alana hanging alone at the center of the main hallway. In its place hung a family collection. Richard as a child. Uthan graduating. Victoria laughing on a beach. Noah holding Amalie on their wedding day. Sarah standing outside the courthouse. Amalie holding Nora. Not everyone in those photographs had been wealthy. Not everyone had been welcomed. Not everyone had been treated fairly. But every person pictured belonged to the truth. And that, Amalie decided, mattered more than protecting any family image. On the second anniversary of the night Uthan nearly died, Amalie stood outside the mansion beneath a clear autumn sky. Uthan joined her. "You thinking about that night?" She nodded. "I thought my life was over when I walked through those gates. And instead..." Amalie looked at the house. "It started telling me who I was." Uthan smiled. "That's annoyingly poetic. I learned from fortune cookies." He laughed. Then his expression became serious. "I'm glad you ignored my grandmother." "So am I. You know what still bothers me?" "What?" "If you hadn't been there." Amalie stopped him. "But I was." Uthan nodded. Sometimes that was enough. Not every painful memory needed to become a doorway into fear. Some could become evidence. Evidence that ordinary people often carried extraordinary courage. Evidence that status could blind people to the value standing right beside them. Evidence that cruelty could postpone truth but could not permanently erase it. And evidence that a maid standing quietly in the background of a billionaire's home might carry within her a history powerful enough to rewrite the meaning of the family name hanging above the gates. Amalie had entered the Watmer estate as an employee nobody considered important. She had left believing she had been rejected. She returned as the daughter they had hidden, the sister who had saved their son, the mother of their granddaughter, and the living proof of a secret that money had protected for decades. But the greatest thing she returned with was not the folder. It was not the DNA result. It was not the marriage certificate. It was not even the photograph. It was the one thing Alana had spent a lifetime trying to control. The truth. And once the truth walked through those gates, no amount of wealth could order it back outside. Dear viewers, if Amalie's story touched your heart, let it remind us never to measure another person's worth by their uniform, job title, bank account, or social position. The person serving dinner may carry more courage than the person sitting at the head of the table. The employee nobody notices may one day be the only person willing to act when everyone else is afraid. And kindness shown when there is nothing to gain can reveal more about a person's character than all the wealth in the world. If you believe Amalie was right to save Uthan despite being ordered to stay back, if you believe Richard's family was wrong to judge and humiliate her, and if you believe truth, compassion, and human dignity should always matter more than status, please kindly subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. And in the comments, tell us, would you have forgiven Richard? Would you ever forgive Alana? And if you discovered that the family who threw you away was actually your own, would you return for justice, forgiveness, or simply walk away?